Stop solving your future. A Zen story on letting go of control. Right now, you are likely carrying a buzzing, heavy stagnation throughout your limbs, a profound exhaustion born from trying to mentally solve the next 5 years of your life from your mattress. You lie awake in the deep hours of the night, gripped by an absolute refusal to make a single real choice until a perfect, flawless outcome can be fully guaranteed. This chronic need for certainty keeps your mind racing through endless calculations, drawing and redrawing your strategies while your body remains entirely frozen under the pressure of your indecision. You treat the natural risk of being alive as an active emergency, believing that one unmapped step will bring total ruin to your future path. Your thoughts are moving like a relentless brush over an overcrowded chart, leaving your lower back tight, your mind overstimulated, and your spirit in a narrow way station of your own making. The air in your room has gathered the thick, comforting aroma of burning lamp oil, the scratchy texture of dry horsehair bristles, and the cool, damp touch of a mountain fog passing outside the glass. Let your body settle directly into the firm, unyielding plane of the mattress beneath your hips, feeling how it supports your full weight without demanding that you outline a single coordinate of tomorrow's journey. There is a deep, quiet validation waiting for you in this dark space, an assurance that your stagnation is not a flaw in your design, but a natural fatigue from attempting an impossible human task. No hidden transformation will be forced upon your awareness during these hours, and your living breath requires no finished blueprint to remain completely valid, whole, and safe just as it is. You are permitted to let the unwritten chapters exist without your active supervision tonight. We often imagine that our late-night planning is a sign of practical wisdom, or that if we can just collect enough data in the dark, we will finally earn the immunity to move forward without fear. But a surprising, liberating insight from the lineage of the Buddha suggests that our exhaustion comes from a completely different kind of mistake. The mind does not suffer because the road ahead is unformed, but because we are trying to ink the entire mountain pass onto a single sheet of silk before we ever step onto the trail. This desperate need to control the landscape turns the wide potential of your life into a heavy, paralyzing prison, because you are using your limited vitality to fix a destination that can only be known by walking it. You are fighting the very nature of an unwritten path out of a quiet dread of making a wrong turn, forgetting that the crossroads are beautiful precisely because they allow your spirit to adapt, respond, and find its own balance. It is deeply draining to live your life as a meticulous mapmaker at a literal crossroads, constantly recounting the variables while your abdomen absorbs the cold stress of your hypervigilance. Right now, dear friend, you might notice a distinct, rigid tightness locked directly across your pelvis, or a subtle, hot restriction in the muscles of your forehead. This physical armor is the direct somatic price of a mind that has been trying to force a guarantee from the dark, hour after hour, treating the natural fog of the future as an aggressive enemy rather than an open space of potential. Maybe you have felt this too, a heavy weariness that makes it impossible to fully receive a peaceful weekend, because you are already forecasting the challenges of the next winter. We assume that if we can just anticipate every mistake in the dark, we will somehow keep ourselves safe. But keeping the scroll so wide only ensures that your own spirit is starved of the rest it needs to move. In a short while, our journey will lead us to a drafty mountain way station attic, filled with the texture of fraying charts and old brass shears, offering a completely fresh way to relate to this paralyzed life. But before we wander up into those shifting clouds, let us sit softly with the immediate reality of how your body is resting right now. The anticipation of making the wrong choice can feel like a heavy, unrolled chart resting directly over your lower back, its details shortening your breath as you lie perfectly still under the covers. You have monitored this internal boundary for many seasons, believing that if you allowed yourself to relax into the unmapped hour without a plan, everything you cherish would fall into ruin. But notice how much energy it takes to maintain that frantic charting beneath your blankets. Your stomach has grown hard from the restriction, and your awareness is living on the edge of a year you cannot see. Allow a long, unhurried expansion to clear the crowded coordinates of your mind, letting the cool mountain wind move through your center without any resistance or force. As you let that current pass, notice if there is even a tiny pocket of space where your lower belly can loosen completely into the mattress, letting your hips spread out like an unclasped binding. You do not have to settle the ultimate destination of your life before the sun rises, and you do not need to find an accurate answer for every variable to prove your readiness for sleep. The unwritten path requires no human ink to justify its direction, and the space inside your heart in this exact second is completely open, unmapped and free. There is no requirement to see the end of the road from this quiet bed, and you may let the unrolled silk map close its borders for the night. The heavy identity of being a person who must guarantee every upcoming milestone is not your permanent nature, because the events that taught you that terror are completely distant, existing now only as a habit of tension inside your muscles. What you are actually carrying is your ongoing effort to predict a river that was already born to move, a quiet, internal panic that your spirit cannot survive the natural vulnerability of an unformed year. Every time you check a screen for endless data to soothe your anxiety, or hold your heart back from a simple choice out of fear it will be imperfect, you add another line of ink to a sheet that was meant to remain completely clear. You are completely permitted to be tired of this constant calculation, and you may let the dry horsehair brush rest on its stone tonight. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, letting go of the unspoken strategies and the silent documentations you have been planning behind your eyes for so long. Let the small muscles around your lower abdomen relax, releasing the constant, vigilant effort to keep your life from moving against a horizon that you cannot control. Right now, the mountain pass has grown completely dark, and the unmapped trail needs no supervisor, your intervention, or your permission to remain completely quiet. You are safe enough to let the defensive machinery of your thoughts go entirely slack, if it feels right, allowing the brush to dry while the thick lamp oil burns down to a single, peaceful point of rest. The soft rustle of dry fabric sliding over an unpolished cedar table carries a heavy, lingering hesitation when the night air grows damp with high-altitude moisture. Long before the stone steps were cut into the eastern cliffs, a small, drafty way station rested at a literal crossroads on a mountain peak, where the passing travelers paused to check their packs before choosing a trail down into the lower provinces. In the quiet attic of this shelter lived a young scholar named Ren, whose fingers were permanently darkened by the charcoal grease of an inkstone. Ren possessed a remarkably meticulous intellect, a capacity to foresee every possible obstacle in the terrain, and an imagination that treated an unverified coordinate as an absolute guarantee of disaster. While the traders down on the porch joked about the mountain weather, Ren would sit beneath the exposed rafters with a sharp tightness locking his lower back. He looked at the vast, unformed valleys below and felt a persistent, buzzing anxiety about making a single real move. His days were entirely dominated by a desire for absolute predictability, treating the natural unpredictability of the wilderness as a crisis that had to be solved before he could take a single step. This deep stagnation drove Ren to an exhausting, silent labor. Every evening after the station doors were barred, he would unroll a long, fraying sheet of fine silk across his table, a chart he had spent 3 full seasons covering with a massive web of overlapping lines, footnotes, and alternative pathways to Ren. This map was not just a tool for travel, it was an essential shield, a mechanical insurance policy that could eliminate the terrifying risk of making a wrong turn. He would use a fine horsehair brush to sketch the position of every boulder, every stream crossing, and every suspected cliff edge along the 3 mountain trails. The work required an intense, straining focus that left his neck stiff and his eyes dry from the flickering oil light. He believed that if he could just map out every single variable with perfect accuracy, he would eventually discover the one flawless road that carried no danger of failure or regret. As the weeks turned into months, Ren's silk chart grew so dense with dark ink that the original fabric was barely visible beneath the crowded notations. He began to apply tiny drops of white wax to represent changes in the loose shale, or added extra layers of charcoal to indicate where the morning fog might obscure the signs on the trees. The sharp, heavy aroma of burning whale oil filled the corners of the small attic room as he leaned over the scroll, his breathing shallow as he tried to account for the shifting winds and the possibility of early autumn snows. Yet this expanding document brought him absolutely no internal peace. He lived in a state of constant Latinite paralysis, lying awake under his heavy covers to re-verify the distances between the way stations, or worrying that a single miscalculated angle on his paper was setting him up for absolute ruin. The world outside his tiny window continued to move without his validation, the other travelers choosing their paths at dawn. With nothing but a simple walking stick and a small pouch of rice, Ren found that he could no longer look at an invitation to join a caravan without an immediate, suffocating knot of indecision locking his throat. Nor could he think about his future without calculating a dozen catastrophic alternatives. He was so busy trying to guarantee his destination from the safety of his bench that he was never actually moving down the mountain. His life felt like his own unrolled scroll, detailed, heavy, and completely static against the stone table. He had constructed a magnificent fortress of ink and silk to insulate his spirit from the vulnerability of a mistake, but the fortress had become a narrow prison that left him shivering behind his own rows of calculations. At the very center of the crossroads, where the three mountain paths diverged into the mist, lived an old way station lantern trimmer named Master Koei. He was a man of immense silence, his frame permanently curved from carrying oil cans up the outdoor ladders, his hands rough and stained with the grease of the iron lamps. He did not own a map. He did not spend his nights charting the valley routes, and he allowed his simple brass oil shears to rest openly on a wooden ledge near the main post where the damp fog could touch them freely. One midnight, when the shifting mountain clouds began to leak through the gaps in the attic shingles, Rin walked down the narrow wooden stairs into the central hallway. He carried his massive unrolled silk chart under his arm, the heavy fabric rustling against his ribs with every step. His eyes carried the dry, exhausted look of a map maker who had run out of space for his lines. He spread the long chart across the rough counter near the hearth, pointing out the intricate web of variables to the old man. He told Koei about the deep, paralyzing panic that kept him stuck at the crossroads season after season, the terrifying certainty that if he chose a path without an absolute guarantee of safety, his entire life would fall into ruin. He explained that he had spent his youth refinement of this chart to eliminate every possible error, but the weight of the variables was now making it impossible for him to move at all. He asked the lantern trimmer what secret method he used to see through the deep valley fog, because he could no longer endure the agony of standing still while the years moved past him in the dark. Koei did not offer a profound lecture on travel, and he did not criticize the overcrowded lines on the silk. He simply stopped his work, his fingers resting gently against the handle of his blunt brass shears, which he used for trimming the charred wicks of the station lamps. The tool was simple, dark with old carbon, and operated entirely within the small 3-foot circle of light cast by the single flame over the counter. The old man looked at the dense web of ink, then reached out and placed his heavy brass tool directly over the center of Ren's map, covering a dozen alternative routes with its solid, unpolished weight. He did not speak a single word. He merely picked up a small oil can, trimmed a single millimeter of burnt fiber from the lamp wick, and pointed out the window toward the dark, unmapped trail that dissolved into the midnight fog. Ren felt a sudden, sharp wave of resistance tighten his chest as he looked at the open window. The thought of stepping out into the shifting mist without his annotations felt like an act of absolute destruction, a deliberate surrender of his intelligence to the very chaos he had spent years trying to conquer. But the old trimmer's eyes remained completely steady, as open and unconcerned as the empty mountain pass under the dark sky. Ren looked at the brass shears, noticing how they performed their work by focusing only on the tiny fragment of wick directly between the blades, requiring no knowledge of how long the road was or how many miles of oil remained in the main barrel. He looked back down at the silk fabric, and for the first time, he saw the true absurdity of his labor. The landscape out in the valley was constantly shifting. The rock slides were moving the paths, The rivers were carving new banks, and the trees were shedding their marked bark at their own pace. His map was not a portrait of reality. It was only a monument to his own fear of uncertainty, a heavy anchor that was freezing his feet while the world moved on. A deep, heavy sigh escaped his lips, a slow relaxation that allowed the tight muscles across his pelvis to soften completely into the bench. He reached out his hands, took the edges of the heavy silk sheet, and began to roll the fabric back into a tight, simple cylinder, watching his calculations disappear one by one into the center of the scroll, until there was nothing left on the table but the bare, honest cedar wood. The quiet rolling of that heavy silk chart reveals a profound truth about what takes place inside your own awareness when you lie awake trying to build an absolute guarantee for your future. When we inspect the mechanism of our late-night distress, we frequently discover that we are treating our lives like an unpredictable mountain pass, trying to ink every potential change before it ever shows itself. We live with an unspoken, deep dread of what will happen if our current stability shifts, leaving our hands empty and our path completely unmapped. This hunger for absolute certainty drives us to constantly rehearse our upcoming decisions, or endlessly review our past errors under the blankets, as if our mental tracing could somehow force the flowing world to harden into a permanent pavement before the sun rises. We assume that if we can just calculate every possible disappointment with enough intensity, we will finally earn the right to move forward without fear. When you look closely at this habit of pulling a detailed map, you can see how easily the mind turns its natural fear of uncertainty into a permanent form of internal paralysis. You begin to define your very essence, not as a living soul who is simply navigating a very complex, unwritten journey, but as a person whose baseline security is fundamentally fragile because you cannot guarantee the outcome of your choices. We try to correct this perceived emotional deficiency by using intense self-judgment and pressure as our primary motivators, falsely believing that if we judge our current hesitation harshly enough, we will eventually force ourselves to become organized enough to conquer the wilderness. But self-reproach is a brittle, cold frost that cannot bring any true stability to your feet. It only keeps your attention locked onto the imaginary disasters of your own making. You become so accustomed to the familiar, dull ache vibrating across your pelvis that you begin to mistake that constant, draining vigilance for your actual name. The core insight of Buddhist wisdom draws a very sharp, very merciful distinction between the raw conditions that life naturally delivers and the extra suffering our mind constructs through its own desperate attempts at manipulation. Your journey through this world will always present you with certain unmapped transitions, sudden situational changes, moments of emotional emptiness, and intervals where your visible path feels entirely buried beneath a heavy drift of fog. This initial reality is like the crisp wind of the high crossroads touching an exposed face, a clean, inevitable friction that is simply a part of possessing an authentic, growing human life. But the mind, in its terror of making a mistake, immediately transforms that single foggy evening into an endless emergency. We add an immense secondary burden of stress by demanding that our horizon should be immediately transparent, or by convincing ourselves that we must completely exhaust our current vitality to force an unripened answer from the dark. Imagine an open mountain ridge where a small grove of young bamboo stands completely exposed to the weather, receiving the shifting storms and the morning sun with an unshifting, effortless presence. When the strong winds blow through the pass, the thin stalks naturally bend, allowing the current to pass through their spaces before returning to their upright position without any resistance from the root. But if a frantic traveler becomes terrified that the movement will break the alignment of the grove, and he begins to frantically tie heavy, rigid iron splints around every single flexible stem to keep them perfectly still, his desperate effort only creates a massive, brittle wall that snaps when the heavy freeze arrives. He ruins the natural endurance of the plants not because his hands are malicious, but because his intense refusal to let the wind exist creates a permanent weight that fractures his own shelter. The raw landscape was never an enemy to the growth. Your rigid, hypervigilant manipulation of the step is what creates the fracturing tension that disrupts your rest tonight. True peace does not mean that the unwritten chapters of your career, your relationships, or your health will suddenly display a flawless blueprint upon your wall, or that the world will completely change its rules to guarantee you a life without any wrong turns. Liberation arrives when you finally change your relationship with the unknown, allowing the vast container of your present awareness to hold the misty trail without letting that lack of data pull your physical body out of its natural alignment. You stop treating every anxious projection as a solid, undeniable reality that must be resolved from your mattress before you are permitted to close your eyes. When you notice a sharp, dense loop of planning arising behind your forehead, you can perceive it as nothing more than a single gust of fog moving across a very broad alpine valley, a temporary current that will naturally spend its density if you simply keep your fingers loose. By letting go of the need to remain a permanent map maker over an unmanifested future, you are not committing an act of neglect against your practical life. You are simply recognizing that the truth develops its strength deep within the step, entirely out of sight, and no amount of midnight grinding can assist the traveler in finding his path through the dark before he walks it. This internal transformation is incredibly subtle. It does not require a dramatic breakthrough or a complete rewriting of your practical goals. It is as simple as taking one single unhurried breath before you follow an old habit of self-reproach, noticing the familiar pull in your lower back, and deciding to let the silk frames of your mind roll shut for the remainder of the evening. You are giving your spirit permission to inhabit the actual sanctuary where your spine is resting right now, instead of running back to the freezing ledges of an unpolished year. In a short while, we will explore how this deep way station wisdom can be carried out of the attic and into the specific daily patterns of your modern life. But for right now, let yourself sit with the immense relief that comes when you realize you do not have to finish the architecture of your entire 5-year strategy tonight. The world is turning without your supervision. The unplowed rows are holding their positions in the dark, and your value as a living soul requires no validation from a destination that was never meant to show itself in the dark. You are entirely permitted to let the muscles of your pelvis become soft and spacious, watching the old habits of prediction lose their grip until there is nothing left to hold on to but the simple, solid reality of this present hour. Let the warm, quiet space of your awareness observe how tired you have become from this constant drafting of alternatives. You can feel the actual texture of your linen, the cool air touching your skin, the steady weight of your hips against the bed. These things are immediate and real, while the unmapped years are completely transparent, existing now only as clouds of ink that carry no actual power to shorten your breath. You are completely safe to leave the brush on its stone tonight, letting the coordinates blur into the darkness until your whole mind becomes wide, quiet, and completely free of the need to know the end of the road. Let us take a quiet moment to pause right here, allowing the thick, comforting aroma of the way station oil to settle softly around the space where you are resting. There is absolutely no requirement to arrive at any sudden conclusion tonight, and no pressure is being placed upon your mind to complete a flawless chart of your life before the morning comes. If it feels right, allow your awareness to move gently toward the natural, unforced movement of your breath, just as it is occurring in this exact second. You do not need to alter its rhythm, and you do not need to make it conform to any idealized standard of perfect alignment. Simply observe the cool sensation of the air as it touches your nostrils, and follow the soft collapse of your abdomen as that breath returns to the room. With each exhalation, perhaps you might permit your lower back, your pelvis, and your forehead to sink just a fraction deeper into the surface beneath you, letting the mattress absorb the full physical reality of your frame. As you lie here in the dark, you might become aware of a specific future variable, an unchosen choice, or a chronic habit of mental charting that has been circulating through your thoughts tonight. Instead of trying to push this protective urge away or forcing yourself to stop feeling anxious about your path, see if you can simply give it permission to be observed. You might imagine that this persistent need to guarantee your destination is like a heavy, unrolled sheet of silk, held tightly across your lap, its dense black lines creating a subtle friction inside your awareness. There is no need to judge yourself for holding on to this protection, because it makes complete sense that you would try to secure your happiness by maintaining a meticulous map. Even noticing that your muscles are braced against the unmapped year is enough, a soft, compassionate recognition that requires no struggle and no sudden transformation. Perhaps you can look directly at the emotional texture of this habit, naming the pattern quietly inside your own understanding without any blame. You might whisper to yourself softly, "This is the old habit of constant calculation." Notice where this persistent weariness is expressing itself in your physical body right now, perhaps as a dry restriction across your lower belly, or a subtle, hot holding in the muscles of your forehead. If it feels comfortable, imagine mentally letting the edges of that heavy silk sheet roll slowly inward, allowing the overcrowded coordinates to slide away from your focus without any effort from your fingers. You are not abandoning your practical goals or pretending that your decisions do not matter. You are simply giving your pelvis permission to loosen completely into the dark, letting the workspace rest without your active management. With your mind's eye, visualize that specific worry, that stiff line of chronic hypervigilance, being received by the deep silence of the cedar table. You do not need to grind a single stone of ink, and you do not need to force an immediate solution. You only need to let the paper roll itself shut. Watch as the mental image naturally begins to change at its own speed, the sharp black lines of the chart losing their rigid definition as they blend into the small, warm circle of light cast by a single brass oil lamp. Let the visualization move without any effort from your side, watching the wide mountain pass absorb the full density of your projections until the attic feels completely uniform and calm. There is complete safety in allowing this inner practice to dissolve into the deep quiet of the room, knowing that you can return to your practical life whenever you are ready. For right now, in this unhurried interval, your only requirement is to return to the simple physical surface of your bed. Notice the dry, clean texture of the linen against your wrists, the warm temperature of the air touching your skin, and the steady, automatic rise and fall of your chest. You do not have to finish the architecture of your entire destiny before the dawn arrives, and you do not need to achieve a state of absolute certainty tonight. The high mountain pass is completely dark, the horsehair brush is resting on its stone, and the unwritten trails require no supervision from your tired thoughts as you allow your presence to sink fully into the ground beneath you. As your frame continues to find its natural weight against the bed, perhaps you can perceive how the simple presence of the brass oil shears represents an entirely different way of moving through your dark hours. They do not look down the mountain trail or try to determine how many miles of path remain clear in the valley. They operate entirely within the immediate circle of available light. They perform their task by trimming only the single millimeter of burnt fiber directly between the blades, requiring no knowledge of the final destination to keep the flame burning clearly. You can allow your awareness to rest in that same small circle of immediate reality tonight, choosing not to follow every line of ink that stretches out into the unformed distance. Even noticing that your mind wants to reach for the scroll is enough, a gentle observation that requires no judgment and no force. You can let your thoughts rest on the dry, soothing texture of the cedar wood that seems to fill the quiet spaces of your mind, a clean and grounded imagery that brings no demands and no parameters. You are not required to guarantee the safety of your career, your relationships, or your health before you are permitted to close your eyes. The mountain fog is passing outside the window without any assistance from your vigilance, and the crossroads are resting quietly in the dark without asking for a single map to justify their existence. You are completely permitted to let your long-term strategies go entirely slack, watching the old habits of calculation lose their density until there is nothing left but the quiet, rhythmic expansion of your breath, holding you safe in the dark. The autumn freeze arrived on the ridge with a sudden, devastating weight that turned the shifting mountain mist into thick sheets of white rime, sealing the joints of the cedar siding with brittle needles of ice. Ren spent his morning sitting near the low counter of the central hallway, watching the heavy fog accumulate against the window panes until the view of the crossroads was completely erased by the storm. Across from him sat the old lantern trimmer, Master Koi, whose fingers were slowly working a small piece of emery cloth over the dull blades of his brass shears to remove the carbon crust left by the oil lamps. He did not offer a new method for predicting the alignment of the mountain trails, and he did not suggest that the weather would clear before the provisions in the cellar ran low. He simply reached out with his bare, calloused thumb, pressed the pivot screw of the shears to test its alignment, and went back to his slow, rhythmic maintenance. On an evening when the northern gale began to produce a low, vibrating hum through the structural beams of the attic, a shivering merchant stumbled through the waystation door, collapsing against the log post. He brought word that a massive landslide had occurred 3 miles down the western trail, entirely swallowing the stone markers, breaking the wooden handrails, and altering the slope of the ridge so completely that the old path no longer existed. Ren felt an immediate sharp wave of heat paralyze the muscles across his lower belly, his mind instantly spinning into a frantic, dizzying loop of calculation. He reached out to unroll his silk chart, his eyes darting across his meticulously drawn lines. But as he looked at his footprints and coordinates, an intense, suffocating panic filled his throat. His map was entirely useless now. The landscape had broken the rules of his paper, leaving him standing on an unmapped edge without a single guarantee of survival or direction. The internal compulsion to find an immediate solution was screaming behind his eyes, tempting him to stay up for 3 straight nights to redraw the entire western quadrant from his imagination, to regain his sense of control. He looked over at the old trimmer, who had not even stood up from his bench, his rough hands continuing to guide the oilcloth along the brass metal without a single pause in his breathing. Koi did not tell him to ignore the danger of the broken trail, and he did not offer an artificial word of comfort to soften the reality of the storm. He simply reached down and trimmed a tiny fraction of charred wick from the small desk lamp between them. Ren took a long, unhurried breath of the damp air, noticing how the single flame did not expand to show the broken road out in the dark. It simply maintained its small circle of light on the bare cedar planks. Instead of running back to his desk to force a new set of variables onto his silk, Ren chose to sit completely still on the rough wooden floorboards, allowing the heavy, unformed reality of the landslide to exist in his awareness without trying to repair it. For several minutes, his heart hammered against his ribs as his racing thoughts tried to convince him that his lack of a strategy was an act of total self-destruction. He looked at the merchant, who was shivering by the hearth, and instead of demanding more data about the missing path, Ren reached out, lifted a heavy iron kettle from the crane, and poured a cup of warm water for the traveler. This small, disciplined act of care required no knowledge of the valley routes, and it did not depend on a finished map. It was simply the very next step appearing directly between his hands. A quiet, spacious realization began to settle into the rigid muscles of his pelvis, breaking the tight paralysis that had held his frame since the news arrived. He saw that his long-standing habit of treating every unformed day as a personal emergency had never actually kept the mountainside from shifting. It had only prevented him from meeting the actual reality of his life with any true resilience or clarity. He looked down at his silk map, which was still half unrolled on the counter, and realized that his suffering did not come from the broken rocks on the trail, but from his own intense attachment to a blueprint that was never real to begin with. He reached down, took a clean, dry cloth, and gently wiped a smudge of oil from the edge of Koji's counter, choosing to inhabit the 3 feet of space directly in front of his chest rather than trying to rule a horizon he could not see. He did not magically lose all his anxiety about the winter, and he did not pretend that the journey down the mountain would be easy or without risk. He simply stopped treating his fearful thoughts as absolute truths that had to be resolved before he could rest, allowing the deep fog outside to remain completely unmapped while he sat with the old man in the quiet of the station. He reached out his hand, picked up his long roll of silk, and placed it gently on a dark shelf behind the woodpile, not out of anger or despair, but as a quiet return of something he no longer needed to carry. He had not become a perfect traveler in a single evening, but the phantom need to guarantee his path had lost its weight, leaving his spirit completely soft as he prepared to face the unwritten trail one step at a time. The old trimmer looked up from his work, his face catching the soft orange glow of the single lamp wick, and nodded slowly toward the dark shelf where the scroll was resting, his silence carrying the deep, unshakable wisdom of the crossroads. Ren sat back down near the embers, his legs loose, his forehead cool, and his breath moving in a slow, rhythmic tide that matched the steady burning of the oil lamp. The tomorrow was still entirely dark, the path down the mountain was still broken, and the valley below was still buried beneath a heavy drift of snow. But as he allowed his frame to sink into the floorboards, he understood that he only ever needed enough light for the single step his foot was currently making, and that the unmapped space ahead was not his ruin, but the very place where his life was waiting to be walked. The deliberate act of placing that single silk cylinder onto the dark shelf behind the logs reveals an incredible transformation in how we can treat our internal processing of uncertainty during these quiet midnight hours. When we dissect the hidden engine of our late-night panic, we constantly find that we are treating our lives like an unpredictable mountain pass, trying to wrap every passing possibility in thick, protective layers of strategic prediction so that we never have to face the sudden wind of a new disappointment. We live with an unspoken, heavy dread of what will happen if our current clarity dissolves, leaving our hands empty and our path completely unformed. This anticipatory grief drives us to endlessly project our worries forward, or continuously replay our past missteps beneath the blankets, as if our mental tracing could somehow force the flowing world to harden into a permanent pavement before the sun rises. We believe that if we can just anticipate every possible error with enough intensity, we will finally earn the right to exist without fear. When you look closely at this habit of constant mapping, you can see how easily the mind turns its natural fear of the unwritten into a permanent form of identity. You begin to define your very essence not as a living soul who is simply navigating a very complex, unwritten journey, but as a person whose baseline security is fundamentally fragile because you cannot guarantee the outcome of your choices. We try to correct this perceived emotional deficiency by using intense self-reproach and shame as our primary motivators, falsely believing that if we judge our current hesitation harshly enough, we will eventually force ourselves to become organized enough to conquer the wilderness. But self-judgment is a thick, cold frost that cannot bring any true stability to your core. It only keeps your attention locked onto the imaginary ruins of your own making. You become so accustomed to the familiar, tight band vibrating across your lower belly that you begin to mistake that constant, draining vigilance for your actual name. The core insight of Buddhist wisdom draws a very sharp, very merciful distinction between the raw conditions that life naturally delivers and the extra suffering our mind constructs through its own desperate attempts at manipulation. Your journey through this world will always present you with certain unmapped transitions, sudden situational changes, moments of emotional emptiness, and intervals where your visible path feels entirely buried beneath a heavy drift of snow. This initial reality is like the crisp wind of the high crossroads touching an exposed face, a clean, inevitable friction that is simply a part of possessing an authentic, growing human life. But the mind, in its terror of making a mistake, immediately transforms that single foggy evening into an endless emergency. We add an immense, secondary burden of stress by demanding that our horizon should be immediately transparent, or by convincing ourselves that we must completely exhaust our current vitality to force an unripened answer from the dark. Imagine a large pottery studio where a potter places a fresh lump of wet clay onto a spinning wooden wheel, intending to let the circular motion guide the material into a tall jar. The clay can assume any beautiful form precisely because it remains soft and moist, allowing the pressure of the craftsman's fingers to shape its walls without cracking the underlying structure. But if a frantic apprentice becomes terrified that the spinning clay will stretch unevenly or develop a tiny wobble on the wheel, and he begins to throw heavy handfuls of dry sand and hard stone dust onto the vessel to force it to freeze perfectly straight, His desperate intervention only creates a gritty, brittle paste that collapses under its own friction. He ruins the natural potential of the material, not because his hands are malicious, but because his intense refusal to let the clay remain unformed, while it spins, creates a breaking tension that tears the base. The spinning movement was never an enemy to the vessel. Your rigid, hyper-vigilant manipulation of the unripened clay is what creates the fracturing stress that disrupts your rest tonight. True peace does not mean that the unwritten chapters of your career, your relationships, or your health will suddenly display a permanent blueprint upon your wall, or that the world will completely change its rules to guarantee you a life without any wrong turns. Liberation arrives when you finally change your relationship with the unknown itself, allowing the vast container of your present awareness to hold the misty trail without letting that lack of data pull your physical body out of its natural alignment. You stop treating every anxious projection as a solid, undeniable reality that must be resolved from your mattress before you are permitted to close your eyes. When you notice a sharp, dense loop of planning arising behind your forehead, you can perceive it as nothing more than a single patch of smoke moving across a very broad frontier valley, a temporary cloud that will naturally spend its density if you simply keep your fingers loose. By letting go of the need to remain a permanent mapmaker over an unmanifested future, you are not committing an act of neglect against your practical life. You are simply recognizing that true security develops its strength deep within the step, entirely out of sight, and no amount of midnight grinding can assist the traveler in finding his path through the dark before he walks it. This internal transformation is incredibly subtle. It does not require a dramatic breakthrough or a complete rewriting of your practical goals. It is as simple as taking one single, unhurried breath before you follow an old habit of self-reproach, noticing the familiar pull in your lower back, and deciding to let the silk frames of your mind roll shut for the remainder of the evening. You are giving your spirit permission to inhabit the actual sanctuary where your spine is resting right now, instead of running back to the freezing ledges of an unchosen year. In a short while, we will explore how this deep waystation wisdom can be carried out of the attic and into the specific, daily patterns of your modern life. But for right now, let yourself sit with the immense relief that comes when you realize you do not have to finish the architecture of your entire 5-year strategy tonight. The world is turning without your supervision. The unplowed rows are holding their positions in the dark, and your value as a living soul requires no validation from a destination that was never meant to show itself in the dark. You are entirely permitted to let the muscles of your pelvis become soft and spacious, watching the old habits of prediction lose their grip until there is nothing left to hold on to but the simple, solid reality of this present hour. Let your awareness notice how the habit of self-judgment acts exactly like a layer of dry, hardened resin lining the inside of your ribs. We try to use this rigid casing to keep our feelings from shifting, believing that if we can create an absolute boundary against the unknown, our inner world will remain perfectly pristine and untouched by change. But the more we pack our true nature into these artificial compartments, the more we cut ourselves off from the natural warmth of the present moment. We become terrified of our own vulnerability, treating a single moment of sadness or uncertainty as a sign that our entire structure is collapsing into ruin. We forget that a living heart is meant to expand and contract, to feel the full texture of the passing seasons without becoming brittle or cold. When we allow ourselves to look at our anxiety through the simple clarity of the lantern trimmer, we see that true durability comes from being pliable, not from being locked behind columns of ink. The blunt brass shears can execute a beautiful, clean alignment, precisely because they do not try to pierce the entire length of the wick at once. They allow their blades to meet the single millimeter directly in front of their pivot. They hold the weight of the mountain winter not by fighting the gravity of the crossroads, but by restricting their focus to the small circle of available light cast by the flame. Your spirit is fully capable of this same flexible endurance tonight. You do not need to turn your mind into a permanent blueprint to survive the transitions of your life. You can allow your awareness to become like that unpolished cedar counter, letting the warmth of the passing hours move through your center, without leaving a single line of tension behind. Let the tight grip in your lower belly dissolve completely into the supportive surface beneath you, feeling how the mattress receives the full weight of your frame, without asking for a single proof of your permanence. You do not have to settle the ultimate destination of your choices before your eyes close, and you do not need to find an accurate answer for every upcoming winter before the sun rises. The high mountain pass is completely dark, the wild brush is resting in the damp mist, and the great canopy of the night is turning its uncounted stars without a single effort from your mind. You are completely permitted to let your boundaries go slack, watching the old habits of calculation lose their density until there is nothing left but the quiet, rhythmic expansion of your breath holding you safe in the dark. This way station clarity is never meant to stay locked away within the drafty attic rafters of a mountain crossroads. It belongs directly in the middle of your modern, glass-paneled afternoons. We carry our unchosen map cords into crowded train cars, down brightly lit store aisles, and right into the tight silence that follows a sudden phone notification. Think of those specific moments during your week when you find your hand reaching out to tap a dark screen, checking over and over for some sign of reassurance or validation from an external source. In that small, high-tension interval, your inner life is acting exactly like an anxious cartographer in a dim room, frantically sharpening charcoal pencils to make sure your progress does not show a single day of weakness to the world. You are treating an unanswered message or an unreturned email like a major gap in your visible path, using up your precious current energy to force an immediate response from a landscape that may not even be settled. Consider how often you walk through your daily routines with an artificial expression of ease pinned to your features, while your deeper self is dragging a whole pile of unwritten worry through the office corridors. You pretend to have everything sorted because you worry that if anyone glimpses the raw grain on your knuckles, they will see that you are no longer executing the traditional confident posture your background demanded of you. We watch the beautifully filtered lives of our peers on social platforms, comparing our hidden, unformed pages with their visible scrolls, instantly assuming that our own timeline is lagging behind a standard we never actually chose to carry. You feel an intense, crushing guilt whenever you try to sit loosely in a chair or lie down early on your mattress, believing that your physical rest is a privilege you are only allowed to purchase after every single future variable has been fully countered. But this mountain trimmer's wisdom offers an incredibly practical way to step away from the tools without needing to overturn your entire external environment. You can begin to express a quiet, spacious discipline right in the center of your kitchen or your desk, long before the sun goes down. When an old pattern of overthinking flashes across your awareness during a tense conversation, or when a sudden fear of the future tightens your stomach, you can choose to introduce a brief, unhurried pause before your voice leaps out to defend itself. This pause is a deliberate rolling shut of the scroll, a moment where you look at the rigidity in your back and realize that this thought is just a passing cloud of fog drifting through a wide valley. It does not mean your whole life is collapsing into ruin. You are choosing not to give your living hands to an old automated calculation, allowing the brass shears of your mind to focus entirely on the small circle of available light without your active management. You can hold a profound, beautiful devotion for the people who share your life without turning that care into a tight, strangling grip that tries to force their movements into a shape that feels safe to your anxiety. When we try to force a partner, a child, or a friend to match our internal map, we are simply trying to drop our own heavy silk charts across their natural growth, an exhausting manipulation that leaves both people feeling raw and confined. True love acts more like that warm, soot-stained hearth room on the ridge, remaining broad and steady, allowing the other person to develop at their own natural pace while you stay anchored in your own quiet depth. You do not need to wire their branches to make your own existence valid, because your capacity for awareness is already vast enough to contain whatever seasons move through the room. Allow your mind to absorb the liberating truth that you do not need to earn your right to lie perfectly still on this bed. and your worth as a living being is not dependent on how much of your future fortress you manage to force into place today. You can let your bones become heavy right now, simply because the dark has arrived, and the floorboards beneath your room are entirely ready to sustain your weight without asking for a single proof of your invulnerability. You can let the unmapped paths go completely dark tonight, understanding that the only current that contains any genuine warmth, any real texture, or any real breath is the one passing through your lungs in this precise second. The tomorrow you are rehearsing is just an empty valley your anxiety is carving from dry soil, a pattern that carries no actual substance unless you choose to pull it over your chest before the day has even dawned. When you notice your attention creeping forward to predict an old disappointment or mourn a misstep you did not prevent, you can gently hold the movement without a single trace of anger or self-reproach. You might smile at how deeply your conditioning wants to protect you by dragging you back to the freezing battlements. And you can offer that anxious habit a moment of soft validation. You can say to your own heart, the heavy charts have already been left on the dark shelf. The workspace is empty, and there is absolutely no debt left to pay in the middle of the night. Let the simple texture of the present environment settle into your awareness, noticing how the quietness of the hour fits perfectly around your frame. You do not need to resolve the dilemmas of your career or balance the ledger of your relationships before your eyes close. The dark air moving through the room requires no explanations from you, and it carries no memory of the errors you believe you made during the daylight hours. You are allowed to be an unfinished piece of work tonight, a living presence that is completely at ease with its own mysteries. The brass joints have found their rest, the valley outposts are silent, and the space right beneath your lower spine is holding you with an absolute, unconditional strength that requires no effort from your mind to maintain. You can allow your consciousness to unhook itself from the need to be right, or the need to have the final word in an internal argument that has been running through your head since dinner. When we insist on winning these silent debates in the dark, we are merely polishing the edges of our calculations, trying to make our arguments look brilliant so that no one can see how cold we have become underneath. You can let the argument remain completely unresolved, letting the words drop onto the floorboards like loose scrap paper that has no use in a room meant for sleeping. The people who misunderstood you are completely distant now, and your defense is no longer required to keep your true essence safe from their judgment. Let your ribs expand into the vast, quiet space of the mattress, feeling the organic warmth of your own center, rising up to replace the cold density of the metal bindings you dropped. You are discovering that your life does not need to be a continuous combat mission against an unformed future. It can be a simple, light journey that flows around the obstacles just like the mountain stream. Every long breath you take is a clean release of the extra suffering you have been layering on top of your history, a gentle return to the unadorned simplicity of your own being. You are safe here, you are unguided, and you are entirely free to let the watchman's fire burn down to cold ash while you sink into the deep, restorative dark. The mountain pass has grown completely dark now, and the heavy gale that produced a low hum through the structural attic beams has dissolved into the deep, quiet warmth of the way station crossroads. Let the language itself begin to loosen its grain, softening its pace until every single syllable lands like a drop of oil settling onto the unpolished cedar counter. Your physical form is becoming immense and heavy, sinking down through the supportive layers of the bed as the gentle warmth of the small room settles across the front of your body. The long seasonal watch over your internal perimeter has ended for the night, and the heavy silk charts have been left completely undisturbed on the dark shelf behind the logs, far below the surface of your awareness. The unyielding charcoal brush is still, and your fingers have forgotten the permanent curl around the tight measurements of your long-term strategy. Listen to the quiet, automatic expansion of your abdomen, a soft wave of movement that requires no diagrams, no structural coordinates, and no checking from your intellect. With each long exhalation, the center of your pelvis softens completely, letting go of the residual calculation that has lived behind your forehead since your earliest fear of making a wrong turn. You are drifting back into the broad, unmapped space of your true nature. A clear, open landscape that is entirely capable of holding its own stillness without your active management. The rigid lines of your future planning have dissolved into the mountain fog, passing outside the glass, leaving nothing but the simple, unhurried density of your body resting against the mattress. There is no longer any temporary destination to discover before the light returns, and no upcoming path is asking to be traced in the quiet of this hour. The blunt brass shears are resting quietly near the lamppost, undisturbed, unmarked, and completely whole in their simple surrender to the immediate circle of available light. Let your eyelids become twice as heavy as before, closing out the memory of the crossroads, closing out the search for a guarantee that was never meant to define your capacity for peace. You are granted full permission to leave your unwritten chapters unmanaged tonight, to let the defensive machinery go entirely slack, without trying to settle a single variable with your history. The valleys are sleeping perfectly well without your surveillance. The dark is cradling your shoulders without a single condition, and you are allowed to slip quietly beneath the weight of your self-protection. Allow your spirit to sink into the vast, undisturbed vacancy of a traveler who has no need to know where the trail leads in the dark. What if the small circle of light directly beneath your feet is already enough to carry you home? The echo of that question settles softly into the deep spaces of your room, losing its vibration as it sinks into the quiet surface of the mattress. There is no demand for an answer tonight, and no need to construct an explanation to carry across the threshold of your sleep. The vast, unmapped capacity of your mind already knows how to cradle this stillness without your active guidance. You can feel the physical reality of your body growing heavier and more anchored with each passing breath, as if the support beneath you were absorbing the very last traces of the day's calculations. Every tight cord across your hips continues to uncoil. The shoulders spread a fraction wider against the sheets, and the muscles around your temples rest completely soft, freed from the exhaustion of a blueprint that was never real to begin with. Let the cool, damp presence of the mountain fog pass across your awareness, soothing the small channels that have spent hours tightly scanning the horizon for an upcoming danger. You are no longer standing at the literal crossroads, and you are no longer responsible for proving to the world that your timeline is perfectly straight. The travelers have all departed. The lamp trimmer has put away his oil cans, and the entire way station has been given over to the absolute, unconditional peace of the midnight hours. The cedar counter requires no further preparation. The dry horsehair brush has grown cold on its stone, and the long sheet of silk rests in the shadows, completely untouched by the anxieties of the day. Consider the immense patience of the deep valley trees, how they receive the changing seasons and the shifting clouds without ever needing to see the layout of the entire forest or justify their growth to the mountain. They do not spend their nights wishing they could freeze their leaves against the autumn frost, and they do not view an unmapped trail as an error in their environment. They simply stand in the dark, allowing the mist to form and the shadows to lengthen, holding their presence precisely because they do not fight the space they inhabit. Your awareness is permitted to be exactly like that quiet grove tonight, a wide, receptive sanctuary that can house the memory of your old hesitations, without letting those memories shorten the natural movement of your chest. You are not lost in the fog. You are simply returning to the unformed depth that has always sustained your life. The faint, lingering strategies of the afternoon are nothing more than small specks of soot, drifting lazily through the quiet air of the attic, catching a brief glint of the dying lamp flame before settling invisibly onto the floorboards. There is no requirement to reach out your hands to organize them, and there is no need to trace their paths back to the choices that made you feel stagnant. An unheld thought carries no weight in this room, and it has no power to tighten the muscles of your pelvis or restrict the flow of the air unless you choose to pick up the brush again. You can let them pass through the darkness of your awareness, watching them dissolve into the broad, quiet spaces of the ridge without giving them your current breath to keep the calculation alive. You are entering an interval where the pressure of progress has completely faded away, and the frantic ledgers of your daily routine have dissolved like water vapor over the mountain stream. The world around you is completely still, wrapped in a protective, heavy blanket of shadow that requires absolutely no monitoring or verification from your tired thoughts. Your consciousness is drifting back to its original home, to the uncarved, spacious clarity that existed long before you ever learned to fear an unchosen turn or treat your own internal pace as an emergency. This original baseline has never been altered by the variables you failed to predict. It has never been diminished by the paths that remained closed. And it is waiting right here, breathing softly beneath the surface of your frame. Allow yourself to drop completely into that soft, velvet depth now, releasing the names of your mistakes, releasing the plans for tomorrow's confirmation, and letting go of the very need to hold an image of your destination together for the world tonight. The bed is supporting your spine with an absolute, unquestioning strength. The darkness is shielding you from the demands of the day, and your breath is moving through your body like a slow, unhurried tide on a completely silent shore. You can lay down the ledger of your self-improvement entirely, letting the vessel of your sleep drift out into the calm, open spaces where there are no parameters to meet and no coordinates you need to verify before the morning breaks. Every channel in your stomach is clear. Every old restriction has been smoothed by the quiet, and your tired soul is finally permitted to sleep, resting whole, undisturbed, and beautifully complete in the deep current of this single living moment. The darkness deepens its hold around your shoulders, expanding into the spaces between each breath, as if the entire world has stepped back to give your mind a spacious arena to completely dissolve its calculations. You do not have to carry the weight of who you were during the daylight hours, or prepare an answer for the choices that will wait for you when the sun returns to the pass. The anticipation that wound through your forehead has found its level in the wide plains of your sleep, and all the heavy text your anxiety gathered along the trail has naturally dropped away, leaving the surface of your awareness perfectly clear and still. You are no longer navigating. You are no longer guarding an unpolished inner chamber. You are simply resting on the bank of you have survived. Let the weight of your eyelids double in their heaviness, releasing the very last trace of focus, letting the darkness behind your eyes become a soft, warm blanket that envelopes your thoughts. You can feel the quiet rhythm of the room, a gentle rise and fall that matches the unhurried expansion of your chest. The breath comes in as a quiet gift from the night air, cool and unburdened, and it flows out like a wide valley opening into the vastness of an unmapped ocean, where there are no currents to fight. There are no maps to maintain here. No brass tools to watch, and no debts to pay to the future. The measurement cords of the old strategy have been uncoiled so completely that your pelvis can finally rest flat against the support beneath you, sinking down into absolute peace. The small, lingering ripples of prediction that occasionally cross your awareness are no longer demands that you must obey. They are merely distant sounds, like the faint crackle of a cooling wick in a deep oil lamp, echoing softly, and then dissolving back into the absolute silence of the cedar walls. You can watch them appear and disappear without reaching out your hands to catch them, knowing that an unheld thought has no power to pull you out of the sanctuary of this room. The mind has finally grown tired of its own long, strategic game, and it is ready to let the iron shears rest at the bottom of the quiet workshop dust. You are entering a deep, restorative sleep where time has no numbers and the future has no shape. The way station is peaceful. The great mountain ridges are silent, and the space right beneath your lower back is holding you with an absolute, unconditional strength that requires no effort from your mind to maintain. Every single thing you have ever anticipated has rested its arms. Every hollow chamber is clear, and your tired soul is finally allowed to sleep, peaceful, whole, and completely free in the deep current of this single living moment.